there and welcome to Lorena's Labyrinth today, or welcome back. If you're a returning visitor, thank you so very much for your ongoing support. Today we're going to continue with this series of unhelpful thinking styles, and I've decided that I'm going to keep it fairly brief. Basically, just to keep the videos shorter, because obviously I do bang on a bit and it takes a while to get through. So we do with this particular series, I am revisiting the content up until we get into this unhelpful thinking styles. So if you've watched all the other ones, just skip down, if this is your interest, skip down to where we start looking at the unhelpful thinking styles and start from there, because I've decided just to keep repeating the content of the past for the first few slides. If you're new to the channel and this is your first video, I do encourage you to go back and look at the first parts of this series, but otherwise just watch the video from start to finish and that will set the background for you. But anyway, let's carry on. So before we get into the unhelpful thinking styles, of course, it's just a good reminder here that when we're talking about thinking styles, quite often people can be either the top-down processor or the bottom-up processor. And what that means, of course, is if people process their thoughts, they feel the emotion first, they recognize an emotion, they can name it, and then they unpack the thought that is associated with the emotional reaction. A top-down processor, of course, feels or they're aware of the thought that creates the emotional response. The other thing to remember too is that with unhelpful thinking is that these unhelpful thoughts are actually generally below the subconscious and we're unaware of them. And so therefore the idea is that we unpack the thought, we find the thought, and then we can replace it, modify it, and address it. And it works, this style or approaches that I'm going to be giving to you, they work for people whether they're a bottom-up processor or whether they're a top-down processor. It's still about finding that key thought, the activating thought. And of course, just a reminder that our feelings are not thoughts, they're not beliefs, they are our emotional responses, and they're related to how we perceive situations and events that happen around us. And a perception is, of course, a thought. It's an idea, it's a belief, and it's totally different from a feeling or an emotion. In the previous videos, of course, we've also talked about the A, B's and C's, which of course is the activating thoughts, the beliefs and the consequences. And this is all part of reflective tools and journaling, if you like, to be able to unpack, to identify that thought that leads to these unhelpful consequences, because that's where we're going. We're looking at changing consequences, stepping into our power and creating the type of life that we want by unrooting, unpacking these unhelpful beliefs and perceptions and taking a whole new perspective. And this is how we harness the power of our mind. And of course, the process of change occurs through us doing some detective work, which of course we've talked about in the other videos as well. I'm just mentioning it in case we've got people that are watching that haven't watched the previous videos. I do recommend, of course, that you do that first before going forward. But either way, the idea is that, through reflection, we identify the unhelpful thinking, and we then basically either prove or disprove this perception that we've got. We need to ask ourselves some serious questions, which we've outlined here, in an impartial way, as though we're presenting information to a judge or a jury about, is there any validity to these thoughts and beliefs that I have, or the way I'm perceiving this situation? And of course, we've got the string of them there. How realistic are your thoughts, beliefs, and expectations? So this is all part of stepping into mind power as well. So over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at a few different unhelpful thinking styles. That includes the mental filter, jumping to conclusions, personalization, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, and shoulding and musting last week. So today we're going to take a look at overgeneralisation and labelling and why they're unhelpful. And then next week we will look at emotional reasoning and the unhelpful thinking styles of magnification and minimisation. If I get enough time next week, I'll introduce you to the idea of core values. Otherwise, that might be a separate video. Anyway, without further ado, let's crack on. Overgeneralizations is this business of saying you always do, you never do, everyone says, everyone does, things like that never happen for me, I always have that happen, so on, and it is an overgeneralization. It's an umbrella term, and it doesn't look at instances individually, and realistically, it's extremely flawed thinking because not everybody is the same. And when a person unpacks the business of, let's say, for example, if they're pointing the finger at somebody else and saying, you always do this, they will be able to find times when the person doesn't do that if they actually speculate. I mean, it could be a pattern of behavior where it's a fallback pattern and they do that. But is it helpful to believe or to say that, as they say, is it a strict rule or is it just a possibility that maybe in this instance they reverted back to whatever? And can we replace the word with you always to you could, or even better still would have been, I would have liked it if you could have. That's another way of approaching it. I guess the biggest problem is when we make these generalised comments, they lead to the conclusions that basically a person is completely disempowered and that things are outside their control, it's inevitable, and it becomes associated with a feeling or emotion of helplessness. And if you look at your personal relationships or have a think about them, you might notice that generalisations are an ongoing pattern within it. Look, I mean, realistically, sometimes it may be true. If I use a couple of examples, which I found on the internet, which is, that saying of you never do anything romantic for me. Well, that actually could be to do with the language of love. In their mind, they might think that they actually are being romantic towards you. However, you've got a different language of love. Now, we've got videos up on that as well if you want to go and explore it and expand your perception, if you like, about what love looks like and whether or not your partner is being loving towards you. And they might be loving towards you, but you just don't recognize it because it's not in the way you would like. Other times, if we use this example of I always have to take out the garbage, that might be true as well, actually. I think I may have had that catch cry in the past as well. But what can we do about it? We can actually share the responsibility. We could change that or approach it from a position of confidence and empowerment and say, look, do you think perhaps you could take out the rubbish from time to time instead of leaving it for me, because I feel this is an unnecessary burden? Or if you've got children, you might be able to turn around and say, can you take the children out, take the rubbish out for me? There's different approaches to these generalised things. Then other comments that might be, everyone's having a go at me. Well, really, are they? Unpack that a little bit, because I could pretty well guarantee not everyone is. Okay, some people might be, but not everybody will be. And that would be something that could be explored to look at how those relationships can be improved. Other times, general comments. These are a few, as I said, I've picked up off the internet. Every night I come home and those kids have always left a mess. I think I can relate to that one as well. It might be true, but it's not helpful. Okay, it really isn't helpful to use the every and all type comments. And in fact, actually, speaking of the every night I come home and those kids have always left a mess, that might be true, but if you were trying to encourage behaviour change by the kids, you would have to make sure that those times that you come home, that the kids have done the righty and put their toys away or whatever, that you see it, acknowledge it and validate it, and even potentially reward it to encourage this new behaviour to occur. Either way, realistically, when it comes to overgeneralizations, when you start to unpack it, you're always going to find that, well, in my experience, you will always find that it's not actually true in all instances. There will be variations from it, and as an umbrella term, it's just not helpful, because even if it's expanding your sense of frustration and irritation, impacting negatively on your moods, um, the people around you, if they're hearing you come in constantly griping and doing that, you always, you never, that kind of stuff, they can become very frustrated and feel discouraged and depressed as well. And in fact, if I was going to refer to my mental health training, there's a saying actually, which is, for every finger pointing at you, there's three pointing at me. Um, and, because where that's going actually is, avoid starting sentences with you, okay? You always do, or you never do, because that ends up becoming a projection of your emotional needs. Even if, just trying to think how to explain this, right? Even if you're right and you come home and the house is always a mess, okay? When you turn around and you point the finger at the other person and you say, you always leave this house messy, okay? That is still a transfer and projection of your emotional needs, because it's a frustration for you. And understandably so, I might add, adding from my experience. But there is an expectation that people will accommodate your emotional needs, because this is such a sense of frustration for you. But the reality is, some people can live quite comfortably in disorder and clutter. So it becomes a case of, what can you do to actually help the situation to be one where you can feel peaceful and calm? That becomes that mutual respect thing. And so, going back to that, for every finger pointing at you, there's three pointing at me. That's kind of like what I want. You're doing X and Y, but what I want, what I need, and what I would like to have is X and Y, which could be something different. We can talk about that in the comments if you want to ask a question. So, I'd be very surprised if you weren't actually aware of what labelling is as a behaviour before we even enter into this conversation. I like to refer to it as name calling, actually, not so much labelling. But labelling can be problematic anyway, because if we're labelling others, we're judging them, and we're also locking them into um, basically an expectation we might have of them. So, if I was to refer to the workplace when I'm working with people that have got perhaps a diagnosis, this is when labelling becomes very, very harmful and even discriminatory. It kind of conveys to the rest of the world that the person that is being labelled or called a name can't act or do anything outside of the label that we've put on them. But if I step aside from the professional perspective of labelling and name calling of people with illness, then there's the simple factor that I actually recognised it probably when my children were very, very small. And it was like, I just seemed to know from a parental perspective that if I used negative names or labels upon my children, then that would sow a belief within them that ends up, actually, I've found out obviously through my training, that this becomes part of their core belief structure, which we'll get into at a later date. We'll talk about core values. But this name calling stuff, it can become the core value of a person. It's what they believe about themselves, and it becomes the negative mind chatter. Now, as an adult, you'll be able to recognize when you're labeling yourself, because you'll do really simple things like create an error of judgment. And it could be just as simple as dropping a glass or whatever. Oh, I'm such an idiot, or oh my goodness me, I'm so stupid, right? That's all forms of labeling and negative self-critique, okay? Then other times we might label other people, like I said, if they've got a mental illness, or it could be simply, that person, they're so inconsiderate, right? It's a bit like overgeneralising, but it's more personalised, either towards a person, a behaviour in a specific situation, And as I said, it's generally, well, it's negative. It's usually something that's negative. It's not a quality trait. It's not a trait that we would want to magnify, for want of a better description. It's very rare that you'll get a person turn around and have this inner voice that says, oh, I'm so good, I'm so right. I mean, and if they were, we'd sort of question whether or not they were a bit of a narcissist. That word's coming up a bit today. Either way, when we use these negative critiques and judgments about ourselves or others, it's associated with one of the less desirable emotions, shall we say. It could be frustration or anger. It might be followed by disappointment or sadness or whatever. It doesn't bring joy, is what I would describe. It doesn't bring a sense of happiness. So the key to addressing labelling theory is to remember this. When we call ourselves a name or call somebody else a name, even if it's just a thought, pull ourselves up, take a look at the situation. Are we being fair? Are we being reasonable with this label? Are there examples where the label is not true? We can all turn around and point at somebody and say that their behaviour within an instance is unwise. If we want to be harsh about it, we could say foolish. We would be judging the situation or the behaviour, but we wouldn't be judging the person as a fool, because at the end of the day, there may be times when they're actually really quite astute and smart. But, there's also that good and bad and right and wrong, which is just not helpful. So, yes, anyway, judge the person, not the situation. Ask the questions. Is it always how things are? Guarantee you it's not. And find the examples of where this isn't true or hasn't been true. And that can be as simple as, okay, so you might have been distracted and something happened. Actually, a classic case many years ago, I remember I had a sliding door, and I had been looking at the door and thinking, I need to actually fit that properly, as in lift it up and put it on the right spot, but I had been busy and distracted. I hadn't set the time aside to do it. And one day I walked through the doorway and the door just fell down and banged me on the back of the head. Well, of course, I used a lot of name calling to myself that day, interspersed with a bit of pain. Called myself an idiot and all the rest of it. Was I an idiot? No, not an idiot. I was just a busy mum, and I was struggling with time management. But had I been wise, I would have seen that procrastinating on that and scheduling that further down the track would have had an unsavoury consequence for the back of my head. But it didn't make me an idiot. It didn't make me stupid. That's a prime example of how labelling can work. But if we, now that we understand neuropathy and neural pathways and that kind of stuff, the issue with labelling ourselves all the time or other people is that we build this pathway of expectation, if you like, that this is who and what we are. And that is obviously associated with negative feelings and emotions. And then we might have to rebuild new pathways, positive pathways. So prevention's better than a cure. Let's all stop labelling, I say. So, with that said and done now, I'd like to thank you very much for being part of my journey today. I hope the content that I've given to you is helpful. Just a reminder, we'll be pursuing this in part 5 next Friday. If this is something that is helpful to you, you might want to click the subscribe and get notified bell. Until then, as I said, like to say thank you very much for being part of my journey. I shall catch you on the next video. Bye-bye for now. Have a wonderful week. Take care.